So you wrote recently that the West Bank is collapsing because Netanyahu weakened the Palestinian Authority. Could you elaborate on that? Has weakening the Palestinian Authority created a vacuum for some of these more radical groups like Hamas and PIJ to gain a foothold in the West Bank?
Yeah, so this is a process that has been going on for several years and is coming to fruition now. Um, Around 2017, 2018, the PA started losing its hold on some of the cities in the West Bank, most notably Jenin and Tulkarem. And part of it is because of a lack of military capacity. Part of it is lack of funding. Part of it is a lack of legitimacy and popularity. The IDF had a plan to go in and restore them or help them, stop them from losing control, but they did not. There's a lack of popularity in Israel for the PA, partially because there's problems with the idea of a Palestinian state and a Palestinian government, but also partially because of their pay to slay quote unquote program where they fund the families of terrorists, which is something that a lot of Israelis have a justifiable problem with. So for those reasons, despite the fact that the PA has been struggling to maintain its capacity in the West Bank over the last decade almost, Israel has at first not sustained them, not supported them, and over the last few years has, especially with the current very right-wing government, has made efforts to undermine them by depriving them of their own tax money, and building settlements, supporting or tacitly supporting settler terrorism, and making deals with Hamas instead of with them, which led to a lot of these problems and has led to chaos in the West Bank. Now, it's very important to note that this isn't just a problem that Israel created. Iran has been trying to destabilize the West Bank for years, in fact, for decades. But in recent years, they've had more success because the PA is weaker. So Iran is taking advantage of all this, but Israel is kind of letting them in by not buttressing the main bloc to their influence, which is the PA. So there's no military solution to this problem. The solution is a political one. It requires governance. There's no governance in a lot of parts of the West Bank. The parts of the West Bank that are governed, like Ramallah, this isn't happening, or it's happening at a very low rate. And the parts of the West Bank where there is no governance, like Jenin, it's turning into something very similar to Gaza.
Right. So I'd like to pick up on two things there. First of all, you said that the Israeli government had been making deals with Hamas instead. That's the first time I've heard that. And then could you talk a little bit more about Iran funding some of these more radical groups in the West Bank? Because when I was there, I was speaking with a very senior UN official, and I guess two UN officials who commented on the increased sophistication of Hamas and PIJ weaponry, specifically their IEDs. So tell me a little bit about how Iran gets their weapons in, and how Israel has made deals with Hamas. Do you mean directly?
Yes, I do mean directly. So, starting with the Gilad Shalit deal, which was the release of one Israeli soldier in exchange for 1,000 Hamas prisoners, one of whom was Yehya Sinwar. Then Israel had tacit deals with Sinwar when he was in charge to let him stabilize Gaza. From 2018 onward, that included cash payments from Qatar that Israel allowed into Gaza. Then, once the war started, of course, Israel made a deal with Hamas to release hostages in exchange for prisoners and all that. And now it's negotiating with Hamas for a ceasefire for the war. That's not going to happen right now, but it probably will happen at some point. And the upshot of that will be that Israel will have made several deals, tacit and direct, with Hamas, all of which have strengthened Hamas in one way or another, while it hasn't even negotiated with the PA since Ehud Olmert was prime minister, since 2007, 2008. So what that does is it weakens the legitimacy of the PA diplomatically and politically. Israel has been ignoring it as a partner for well over a decade while working with Hamas. There's two schools of thought on why it's doing that. One school of thought, the less cynical one, is that Israel's doing that because Hamas keeps causing problems and you have to talk to them. You have to, reach a resolution to things like the hostages. That's true. Then there's also a more cynical school of thought, which also has some truth to it, which is that Netanyahu doesn't want, the Israeli government doesn't want a two-state solution. Therefore, it's much more comfortable for them to have one government here, one government there, and not strengthen the interlocutor that would be legitimately recognized by the international community, which is the Palestinian Authority. So there is a marriage of convenience there between the Netanyahu government and Hamas, not to say that Netanyahu wants Hamas to be killing Israelis, but rather that at least until October 7th, Israel preferred to have two different governments so that the Palestinians would be weak and divided. Now they should be working with the PA, but they're not. And Netanyahu, the prime minister, knows very well, and so does the army, so does the Shin Bet. They all know that you should be working with the PA. You should be increasing their strength for security reasons. But for political reasons, the government's not doing that because the extreme right wing, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Minister of Internal Security, Bezalel Smotrich, Finance Minister, would lead the government if you strengthen the PA. So that's why that's not happening. As for how the arms are coming in from Iran,
one moment. Could you elaborate on how Israel has negotiated with Hamas specifically in the West Bank? So is some of that money coming in from Qatar? Is that made? Because I've heard a lot about how the Israelis have strengthened Hamas in Gaza. What about in the West Bank?
They haven't. Okay. In the West Bank, Hamas doesn't have an official status in the West Bank. They were, they won elections, fair and square, but the PA didn't honor the elections results. And what ended up happening is they took over Gaza, and they were thrown out of the West Bank officially. They still have cells, they still have terrorists, they still have officials, but there's no Hamas government there. In fact, some people say the PIJ is stronger in the West Bank than Hamas is numerically in terms of material. I don't know if that's true, but Hamas isn't necessarily the strongest terrorist organization challenging the PA in the West Bank. You have the Lions Den, you have the PIJ, you have Hamas, and you have independent squads that are doing a lot of damage that aren't part of anything, that are proving very dangerous. And Iran is working with all of them. Iran works easiest with the PIJ. And since the war started, there's been a lot of reports. I'm not an expert on Jordan or anything like that, but there's been a lot of reports on battles going on the Jordanian border with smugglers employed by Iran. So Iran seems to be employing massive amounts of smugglers, professional smugglers, some Bedouin locals, people who know the area, to try to get arms through Jordan into the West Bank. Early on in the war, I was hearing that Jordan was doing quite well in stopping them. And maybe Jordan did stop a good percentage, but a lot got through. That's clear. A lot is getting through. That's also clear. In addition, a lot of these arms are staying in Jordan. So Jordan is going to have possibly some very serious trouble down the line. Iran also wants to undermine Jordan. It's not their number one priority now, but it's definitely something that they want to do. And it helps them get to the West Bank as well. The weaker Jordan is, the more influence they have in the West Bank. Because Jordan has a genuine interest in stopping these infiltrations and stopping the smuggling of arms. So it's been quite successful. And money's been pouring in, not just arms. And that money has been used to rebuild, and you probably heard about this, saw this when you were in the West Bank, to rebuild what we call explosive laboratories, where they make IEDs, and also they're trying to make larger explosives for suicide belts, the kind that plagued Israel from, what was it, 1994 to 2005. We had suicide bombings in Israel all the time. I grew up in that period. Every time you got on the bus, you thought you were going to die. They're trying to bring that back. And they had an attempt in Tel Aviv that if it hadn't been for an accident that went off early, that would have killed some people in Tel Aviv. That was just 2 weeks ago. And they had several attempts of IEDs and cars laden with explosives in the West Bank, in Gush Etzion and elsewhere over the last few days. So it's working. They're not at the capacity they were during the Second Intifada. They're nowhere near. But they have the highest ability to create explosive devices now that they've had since then.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that these IDF operations are going to be able to stop that. I believe the IDF operations are all going to be able to slow that down.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is, what is the goal of this operation? So I reached out to the IDF for comment for my piece, and they totally dodged this question. And it reminded me of something you said about Israel's strategy in Gaza, namely that the IDF is going from city to city, causing destruction, killing a bunch of people, but never fully occupying Gaza, which means that Israel doesn't own Gaza and then doesn't have to worry about who's going to govern it. And I see a very similar situation in the West Bank, where the IDF comes in for a period of 48 to 72 hours. It seems like since this operation began on August 28th, they might be doing longer and more comprehensive raids, but they cause a bunch of destruction, then they leave. The armed groups in the camp then have time to reconstitute. It seems like all they're doing is, they're kicking a lot of people out. They're causing a bunch of destruction, and they're also fomenting more hatred and driving recruitment for these groups. So what is the strategy, and do you see that similarity to Israel's strategy of destruction, but then not actually owning it in Gaza?
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack here. So the first thing is, I hate to sound pedantic, but what's a strategy? A strategy is an overall goal to achieve something in the long term, and a military doesn't really do that. That's more what the government does. That's more what the decision makers do. A military operation is supposed to fit into a strategy. Our strategy is to achieve this goal in the long term, and then this operation will help us by getting from step A to step B to step C. Israel doesn't have a strategy. There's no strategy. There's intentionally no strategy, to the point where the coalition that Israel had during the beginning of the war with Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot broke up because the two of them demanded that Israel have a wide-ranging strategy that would include the West Bank, Lebanon, Gaza, all that. They said, we need a strategy. We need a delineated, clear strategy we can work from. Netanyahu refused to have that strategy, and they quit. That's how married he is to not having a strategy. And the reason for that is the same reason I mentioned before. If he has a strategy, that will include goals that will be politically untenable, like strengthening the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, strengthening Israeli governance in the West Bank, spending money on helping Palestinians instead of, blowing stuff up, all things that are politically untenable. And any strategy would require that. Same thing in Gaza, but we're talking about the West Bank. But yeah, exactly. It's the exact same thing. There's no strategy in Gaza. The only thing the IDF is told is find the enemy, kill the enemy. Find the enemy, arrest the enemy. That's not a strategy. That's not a strategy. All it is an attempt to kick the can down the road as much as possible. If you lower the ability of the terror organizations now, maybe you prevent a terror attack in 2-3 months, right? So that it is doing that. There's no question that these attacks are hampering the ability of the terror organizations to execute an attack right now. There's no question. The IDF is good at that. But everything you said is correct. In the long term, it's further destabilizing the West Bank, right? Look at the operation this operation in the West Bank. It involved trying to prevent IEDs. How were the IEDs prevented? By destroying entire roads. Roads leading into all these big cities were completely destroyed, and then Israel left. It involved blocking access to hospitals. Why? Because the terrorists will go and hide in hospitals, but also you're blocking regular people from hospitals, right? You're killing people. Some of them are civilians by accident. I'm a critic of Israel and the IDF in many ways, but I don't believe that Israel intentionally targets civilians at all. But civilians die. That creates a lot of rage. That creates a lot of anger, like you said. And if there's no long-term political solution, you're creating more political problems with the operation without even beginning to solve them. So there is no strategy. That's why the IDF didn't tell you what the strategy is. They are embarrassed to not be able to tell you what the strategy is, but that's not their fault. That's because they are not in charge of kind of the strategy. The government is.
Right. What else do I have here? Well, yeah, I guess, what do you make of the argument that even if we're not going to destroy Hamas or PIJ, we still have to undertake these operations. We still have to disrupt the terror cells. And, as you said, it could prevent a terrorist attack 2-3 months down the line. Tell me about how these groups in the West Bank have actually been committing terror attacks. To what extent are they desperate people who are defending themselves when the IDF rolls in to destroy everything? And to what extent are they branching out to other cities, to attacking settlers, attacking IDF outposts? And to what extent are they just, waiting for the IDF to attack them? Because this word terrorist gets thrown around a lot. It just doesn't really mean anything to me. Like, what are they really doing, generally speaking? Okay,
so terrorism is easily definable. It's not the kind of vague word like some people think. Terrorism is, we're talking about attempts to harm civilians by non-state actors for a political goal. One of the mistakes people make with terrorism is thinking that terrorism is somehow worse than other things like war crimes, etc. It's not. It's just a different form of warfare. So people get a little bit hung up on that. If Russia's committing war crimes in Ukraine, or Israel's committing war crimes in Gaza, that's not better than terrorism. It's just different from terrorism. And so these people are terrorists. That's not even a question by any definition. Now, as I said, the operations are necessary in the short term. You can't allow these networks to grow and commit terror attacks. Certainly in Gaza, Israel waited a very long time, many years before going in, and it had to pay a very big price. So the answer is not to do anything. The answer isn't not to have operations. The answer is to couple operations with diplomatic and political solutions. Israel in Gaza right now needs to be working towards creating a sustainable government in Gaza so that this never happens again. So that there isn't another October 7th for Israelis, and also the people in Gaza aren't oppressed anymore and don't starve anymore and aren't bombed anymore. For the good of everyone, this operation, this military operation, this necessary military operation, needs to lead to a government, a stable government that's acceptable to the Palestinians, that doesn't support terrorism. Very difficult to do, but they're not even trying to do it. If you don't try, you're definitely not going to succeed. In the West Bank, the story is much easier. Much easier. You already have a government there. It's not very popular. It needs reform. It needs a lot of work. Everyone who knows the PA knows that they are a very problematic government, but they're there. They're accepted by the international community. They work with Israel against terrorism. They already have all the mechanisms in place. They just need to be strengthened and widened. It's clear what's happening there. But Israel also needs to be doing things that it's not doing. Israel controls most of the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority controls very small areas. They are the areas where most people live intentionally. Israel doesn't want to govern the people. It wants to govern the land, right? So Israel governs most of the West Bank. Area C and Area B in the Oslo process are under Israel. So Israel needs to keep law and order there. Unfortunately, the head of the police, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is someone who's very much on the side of the settlers, supports settler terrorism to some extent, was himself indicted for terrorism when he was younger. So obviously he's not enforcing law and order over there. So these military operations should be supplemented by governance, by political vision. You're right. On their own, they do nothing but blow stuff up. They slow down the development of terrorism, but in the long run, they also deepen the support for it. And here's something important that I think a lot of people are not aware of regarding what you said about the West Bank. You asked, are these desperate people or are these hardened terrorists? And in the case of the West Bank, for now, it's mostly hardened terrorists. The cells in the cities in the West Bank are small, very small, surprisingly small, honestly, considering everything that's been going on. Tulkarem, Jenin, we're talking about 200, 300 people who are the core of the issue. They're all in some way in contact with Iran. Either the people are training them, are trained by Iran, or funded by Iran. These aren't organic organizations. The reason for that is because the people in the West Bank generally look at their lives, look at the lives of the people in Gaza, and say, you know what? I don't want that. It could be a lot worse. Things are bad, but it could be a lot worse. The more Israel makes the West Bank look like Gaza, the less salience that's going to have. The more people, just regular guys, like in Gaza in a lot of cases, will say everything is so terrible, I'm going to take up arms for two reasons. They might lose their jobs because of economic instability, and they might lose their loved ones, friends, be filled with hatred. That process, I'm sure, is occurring in the West Bank, but it's still very embryonic. Right now, we're talking about hardened terrorists. In Gaza, it's a whole different story. In Gaza, you have no work. If everyone there has family members who are dead, just about everyone is. So you're angry. You don't have anything else to do. Someone gives you a gun. Someone gives you some money. You'll go fight. So Gaza, it's much wider. West Bank, not yet. But no governance, continued operations, it will widen.
Yeah, I would disagree that it's embryonic. I wouldn't say that, and specifically that there are a lot of average people that are joining these groups just because the destruction is so widespread. I mean, all the roads chewed up, the buildings destroyed, raw sewage in the streets. I have a hard time believing that it is now just a group of hardened terrorists. I think like a lot of normal people are joining these groups in those areas that the IDF has been operating in intensely, Ner Shams, Jenin, Tulkarem, and in areas nearby where they are expecting Israeli raids to do the same. I just have a hard time believing that. But
I don't want to push back. I'm curious. Did you talk to people who had joined, or is this how you feel like it makes sense to you? Like, what are you basing this on?
Yeah, we talked to a few people. I mean, I didn't ask anyone if you're a member of these groups. There was definitely, it definitely felt like from the moment we walked into these camps, there were eyes on us from people who were part of these groups. It definitely felt like the entire local community was part of this violent resistance. But I can't say it for sure. It just didn't make sense to me, generally speaking.
Okay. Well, I wasn't on the ground. You were. I'll defer to you. My sources are Israeli, and honestly, haven't always been. They're not always right, and they're. Yeah. I'm not saying I have better sources on this than you. You were there. I wasn't. So yeah, well, I'm sorry to hear that, but it also makes sense.
Well, I look forward to sending you the piece. Like, I just got a bunch of interviews translated, haven't read them all. The one thing I can say is that the Hamas presence was very conspicuous in Tulkarem. There were posters of Sinwar and Hania everywhere.
That's not the same as actually joining the fighting. The popularity, the popularity of Hamas is much higher in the West Bank than it is in Gaza.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah, because they're not suffering the consequences as much yet.
Yeah, my understanding is that like in Jenin, there's a local brigade, there's like a brigade, which is this umbrella group of all the different fighters, and I imagine it's the same in Tulkarm. I have one question about Israeli society, but before that, is there anything pertinent to the West Bank discussion that you want to add? Anything about this operation? Do you have a prediction for how things are going to play out there in the next 6 to 12 months, maybe?
I think it's very important for people to understand that we are in the middle of the third intifada. There's somehow that's been under the radar, and we have been in the middle of the third intifada since maybe late 2022. This has been going on for a long time. It's just been escalating, and I think it's going to get much worse. I don't see any solution. I don't see the government is trying to find a solution to this. I think it's going to completely destabilize. And another problem we haven't mentioned at all, or mentioned very vaguely, is the settlers. The settler levels of settler terrorism are getting very high. Like nothing that's ever happened before. They organize operations that involve hundreds of people now. When I say operations, it's really a bunch of hoodlums running into a city. They're not very professional or anything, but there's never been numbers like this before. It used to be that maybe you had 4 or 5 troublemakers in a settlement who tried to do something. Now it seems to be all the young people in the area, in some of these more isolated settlements, and that of course will spread the operations of these terrorist groups, the Palestinian terrorist groups, because the settlers are terrorists too, to areas that are more peripheral, to areas that are outside of the refugee camps, and it will bring a lot of death and destruction to the roads, the internal roads, killing settlers. Probably settlers will kill Palestinians as well, and that will overstretch the military. Israeli military is right now in Gaza. It might end up fighting in Lebanon. It has the biggest deployment in the West Bank, and it's going to have to be stretched to all these small settlements to defend them. It's going to be overstretched. It's not going to be able to cover everything. And long term, odds are the PA is going to collapse, unless, because Israel keeps going in, the PA loses legitimacy, Hamas keeps getting stronger. Long term, I think the West Bank turns into Gaza. I hope it can be prevented, but I'm talking. This is like a process that might take about 5 years. But unless someone does something to strengthen the PA, that's what's going to happen.
I totally agree, and I think that these refugee camps are already turning into little Gazas, and eventually, I guess it spreads to Ramallah. I guess it's a worst case scenario, right? Okay, so I wanted to ask you about something Netanyahu said regarding the general strike, which was that people striking are showing support for Sinwar and Hamas. So how dangerous is this kind of rhetoric, and what does it indicate about...
You're talking about repeat the question? I'm not sure I fully understood.
Yeah, so after the 6 hostages were killed in Gaza, right, there was a general strike, and Netanyahu said that the Israelis out on the streets were basically showing support for Hamas and Sinwar. What do you make of that kind of rhetoric? What does it say about this kind of government? Evidently, opposition is not tolerated in authoritarian states, and it seems like Israelis are realizing that their government is dangerous to themselves, not just to Palestinians.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on here. One is this government is definitely the most has the most of an authoritarian bent of any government Israel's had, at least in modern history. You could go back to the early days and talk about that, but that's a different story. It definitely in modern history, especially with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and also Netanyahu's willingness to do a lot to avoid facing consequences for his corruption scandals and now to stay in power. And then you also have the corrosive influence of war on democracy in general, which you see everywhere. You know, in Ukraine, you also had elections suspended. It's not their fault, but you had elections suspended. Every country that you think about, the U.S. after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, this is what happens at war. So you have both of those things happening at the same time. Normal but regrettable processes of wartime, and the government that's over eager to take advantage of it and was already doing some of this before. Combination is very bad. And then you also have a third element, which is that kind of populism that we're seeing more and more in the world from right-wing leaders. And that populism involves setting your people against each other, you know, Donald Trump style, and so on and so forth. Netanyahu always did a little bit of that, but since he learned from Trump, he does a lot more of that. So that's what's at play here. Netanyahu's in a pretty desperate position right now in terms of the hostage deal. He's in a very bad position. The vast majority of Israelis want this deal, 60%. Most Israelis also, fairly or unfairly, it's a little complicated, feel like he's not doing enough to reach the deal. The demonstrators are a real threat to him because they represent most Israelis, according to all the polls. On the other hand, if he does what they want him to do, his government will fall. So his best shot is to try to demonize the protesters, who are families of the hostages are leading them, and saying that they're cooperating with the enemy. It's a very ugly move, but it's a move that comes from his political survival needs, current populism, and the right wing eats it up. And we've also seen on social media a lot of the diaspora Jews also support Netanyahu no matter what he does. We've also seen recent reports from the DOJ that Russia's behind that. Russia's supporting Netanyahu. I don't know if you saw that. Russia's supporting Netanyahu. They have bots supporting Netanyahu. They have bots, and they're involved in all this hostage stuff. So this is a very serious issue. And then, of course, it doesn't help that the police is run by Ben-Gvir, who's the most extreme right-winger. They're beating up protesters. They're arresting people. Just yesterday, someone threw sand at Ben-Gvir at the beach, and they disappeared. No one knows where this person's arrested. Very dark signs. Very dark signs. Israelis are incredibly concerned about what's going on, and this split, this authoritarian versus liberal split in Israel, is might end up having incredibly far-reaching consequences, because of the people in Israel who are the more productive element in society, the ones who pay more taxes, the ones who work in high tech, the ones who serve in the military, they tend to be more liberal. They tend to hate Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu. A lot of them are thinking of leaving. If they leave, the country goes even further to the right. So this whole thing is a real threat to the democratic fabric of the state of Israel. And those comments are just one terrible symptom. There's so many others. It's particularly horrifying, but yeah, there you go.
Yeah, like 10, 15 years from now, what is Israel going to look like if the settler run government, I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it at all, but Israel keeps going to the right, liberals leave, there's a strengthening of this, hawkish consensus. It's going to be hard to call Israel this beacon of democracy in the Middle East in 10 years if this continues, right?
Look, it's hard to call Israel a beacon of democracy right now. Israel's still a democratic country. Israel still has due process. Israel still has fair elections. Let's not exaggerate, not that you were, but let's not exaggerate where Israel is now. And I don't think Israeli democracy is under immediate threat. I don't think enough liberal people are going to leave anytime soon for that to happen. So my guess is 10, 15 years from now, Israel will still be struggling with a lot of the same issues. But if the liberal side in Israel loses, then Israel could turn into a very problematic place, not only morally, but also in terms of its survival. Because if Israel is not rich, not accepted by the international community, doesn't have enough people serving in the military, and so on and so forth, its whole model of survival, which is based on technological superiority militarily, and economic superiority will not be tenable. Yeah. And in some ways, you could look at the deterioration in Israel as Israel becoming a lot more like the area around it. There's more religion. There's more of an authoritarian bent. So that there's also that way of looking at things. But then there's also the authoritarian influence from the West that meets it. Yeah, I don't want to say that Israel is doomed and lost. Maybe that's an emotional response in me. I think Israel still has a shot, but its democracy's in a lot of danger.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, thank you so much. I'll send you the piece when it's out. This has been super valuable, and I'm gonna cut up a bunch of this for socials. Good luck out there, and I commented on one of your Twitter posts once, like your integrity in speaking out against the extremes of your government doesn't go unnoticed.
Thank you.
It makes Israelis look better than anything else when when it comes from within. It really humanizes Israelis, right? Like, and I wish more people would realize that. So
yeah, I like to think that. My critics don't agree, but yeah.
All right.
Thank
Have
you.
a good one.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Send me links to stuff you post.
I will. Okay. Bye.